on top of 2x12 rafters, and I was sitting on a piece of plywood. And you know in the movies where the truck doors fall? Well, somebody said, after I did that, I was telling somebody else that did that, and stuff falling off into the ceiling. He says, you know, you can try to tell somebody what that experience is like until you've done it.
We used to park it underneath.
How your eyes doing?
Well, I've now done it.
Maybe you're more comfortable back there, but you can either do that or move up, whatever you want.
You want?
For those who don't have this, this sheet, you might like to have one. It's what we had 3 years ago when we started the course. And, come in.
You know, remember Tom's? You know Tom.
How you doing?
He's got a beard.
Oh, sure, Tom. I didn't recognize you.
Well, you keep on.
I think I have
You'd
one.
probably have one.
Coming back and
Yeah,
forth.
it's got one.
The camera's high enough, it won't, it's not anywhere.
Richard, do you need one? You
I
don't.
think I got one before. Just let me see.
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, I saw one.
Yeah, I have. Does anybody need? You
Yeah,
probably
I
got
got
one.
Well, I'd like one. Can I have one, Tom? I'll get it first.
Okay. Get one right off the press.
Why don't I give you 2 or 3 more in the
Hey,
back
that's
so
pretty
if
good.
everybody else comes in the door there after you get started, you can hand them one. Thanks. Well, I appreciate you coming. I hope that the second installment of this course works out as well as the first one did. And I think we ought to introduce 2 or 3 new members and semi-new members to our group. This basically is for the new members, however, several of you who want refreshers why you join in too. But Wayne Gentile here is a neighbor of Mark Hopkins, and Wayne came to 2 or 3 functions we had back in 97, 98, I think it was, wasn't it, Wayne?
Yeah.
And I guess you're retired now.
Yep.
And Mark knew you had a little more time, and he thought, well, maybe you'd like to join us. So glad to have you tonight.
Glad to have the opportunity.
Most of you know Herman Feisner. Herman's been with us at least 6 months, and a regular attender. And do I need to say something more about you, Herman?
I don't think so.
Okay. Gene Mowdy, who Bill Rule has told me about several times. Gene and his brother own a Model E2 Stanley, and they keep it down in Smyrna. But Gene lives up in North Philadelphia, Elkins Park, so he has quite a distance to come. But they don't feel they know too much about their car, and they'd like to learn some more. So I think that's why Gene's here. So welcome. Jeff Conley was here with us last week, and Jeff's a friend of Bob Wilhelm, and Jeff and Brian Crozier may have a little competition for the youngest member of our group, but I think, Jeff, you went out. I think you're about a year or 2 younger than Brian, but not much. So happy to have young people with the name of the game here. Got young people like Walt Plumley back there. Walt and I have no business here, but here we are. Anyway, and Tom Stapleford. Tom has been around a few times too, and I'm glad to have you join us, Tom. Tom's a jack of all trades. If you ever need a little carpenter work or painting or anything, roof work, I guess you don't like the high stuff, but he can do it for you. And Gene Matlusky, most of you know, Gene has 2 Stanleys that I know of. Maybe he has more by now.
No, just the 2.
He has the H5, which we had up here for several months, trying to make it run a little better for him. And he has a 10 horsepower model. Was it 61, Gene? Or
61, yes.
yeah, right. And Bill Swogel, do I need to introduce you then? Well, maybe the new college would like to know who you are. Bill has been with us since almost the beginning. I think he attended the second meeting
Yeah, second.
in 1997, been with us ever since. Ken Pratt just came in. Ken's been with us several times in the last 6 or 8 months. And so happy to have you, Ken. I've been going around introducing everybody since you're a little bit late. I'll tell you who the new ones are. We have Wayne Gentili up here and Gene Mowdy, and I don't know if you've met Jeff Conley or not. Jeff's, and you know Tom Stapleton. Maybe you do, maybe don't. Anyway, I think you know the others. This is Ken Pratt, I guess I mentioned that. Bill Schwogel's back there intending to take some pictures tonight as he's done for most of our lectures. And Walt Lumley in the easy chair back there. Walt's an old schoolmate of mine from a few years ago. We graduated sometime in the 20th century from high school. That makes us old, doesn't it, Walt? And then we have Richard Bernard, who teaches at Wilmington Friends, which happens to be the school where Walt and I graduated in 1941. And Richard's been with us almost, well, at least 2 years he's been with us, and he's quite an accomplished driver. So that's the group. Well, I don't know that you're going to learn a whole lot tonight on the intricate workings of a Stanley car, because that comes later. We're starting 2 weeks from now, when whichever's first, boilers, I guess, or maybe it's
Burners first.
burners first, I
Yeah.
guess, then boilers, then engines. But anyway, tonight is sort of a history night, and I thought I would elaborate a little bit on this sheet that was passed out as kind of the history of this course and how it came about and how it got started back in 1997. But I'll try to elaborate a little bit and talk about I guess the history of this property, and then how Stanley Cars came to center on this property, and then the history of Stanley Steamers.
We can turn it down. You mind if I turn it down, Tom?
Turn it off if you want.
Turn it off?
Yeah.
Because it'll
If you-
probably...
If you don't think you need it, yeah. Well, how did this property get here and who built it and so forth? My great-grandfather got tired of being a farmer just before Civil War days and decided he wanted to experiment with making paper. The family farm was 1 mile up Red Clay Creek in Pennsylvania, and the old grist mill there, which was really on part of the farm, was right on the stream, and he converted at least part of the grist mill about 1856 to try to make paper. His sons were just little fellows then, but as they grew up, they kind of liked the paper making business, and that was about the end of farming in the Marshall family. But my grandfather, who was one of the brothers, my great-grandfather had 2 boys. My grandfather was the older of the 2 boys. He and his brother greatly enlarged the paper mill up there, and really outgrew it. And they were doing very well up there in the 1880s when they were still, well, about 30 years old, and they both had families by that time. I have a picture here of the old paper mill at Marshall's Bridge as it looked in the 1880s, about that time. And but they wanted more space and wanted to expand. And the old mill that was right over the hill here had been built, we think, as early as 1730 as a grist mill. And and none of that original 1730 building was still there, but over the years there had always been a mill of some kind down there operating by water power off the stream. And so my grandfather and his brother bought the mill down here. And it's not clear to me whether anybody had ever made paper there before they came or whether they converted it to a paper mill. But this was in 1890, and they bought the mill here. And when you bought a mill property in those days, you got about 100 acres with it, at least in this area, because you always got the water rights. And the water rights usually included at least a half-mile upstream because of the dam and the fall necessary for the wheel and all that. So actually, when they bought this property, it extended far enough upstream that it actually touched the old property that had been the old homestead property up there. So that meant there weren't any property owners in between, and they had a pretty nice setup here for about a mile and a half. Well, not a mile and a half, but a little over a mile up and down the stream. Well, a lot of these, I mean, when you got this 100 acres, you didn't use it all for milling, purpose of milling, so you usually farmed it or had a tenant farmer or somebody to take care of the rest of it. So this property where the house is and where other buildings are now was a cornfield on the old mill property. And my grandfather and his family moved into an old house down here next to the mill, which was called the farmhouse. One end of that house we think is the oldest house in York Lynn, but it had been enlarged over the years and had been kind of modernized in 1890 to look like a modern house of the 1890s. And they lived down there for 7 years, but I guess they thought, well, that cornfield has a pretty nice rise to it, a nice round hill. Wouldn't that be a nice place to build a house? It would still be close enough so my grandfather could walk to work a tenth of a mile maybe. And so that's what they did, and that's how this house got built in 1897. The earliest picture of the house that we really have, I think, was taken about a year after it was built, 1898. You'll notice that none of the outbuildings are there yet, and in fact the house isn't quite as large there as it is now. There was an addition put on the back in the 1930s. But anyway, my grandfather, as far as I know, never drove an automobile. He didn't dislike them, but his health wasn't too good, and he just felt, I guess, that he'd let the boys do it. And my father was the younger of the two boys in that family, and he was the mechanical one, however. His brother really ended up as head of the paper and fiber business, which had been greatly expanded during their time, and was a very good businessman and all that, but he couldn't drive a nail really without hitting his finger. And my grandfather made the comment to some of them, his wife, Uncle Warren, his wife's name was Bertha. And my grandfather said to somebody, well, Bertha may learn to drive an automobile, but Warren never will. Well, Warren did. He drove a car, drove to work every day, but he was not mechanical. Well, anyway, my father got interested in automobiles early on. He loved machinery. He coaxed his parents to let him drop out of school in the 11th grade because he didn't like Latin and some of the things they were teaching at Wilmington Friends, Richard. Well, they didn't want him to drop out of school, of course, but they finally said, well, if you'll take a correspondence course and really study at it, why, we'll go along with that. So that's what he did, and he started to work in the mill when he was about 16 or 17. We have a picture here of men down here at the mill. We think about 1903. My grandfather's standing in the back of all the rest of them. My father's on the left there in the second row. And so that's how it was, and that may have been about all the employees they had in 1903. They had just gotten in the notion of making vulcanized fiber. And the manufacture of paper was an earlier process toward making fiber. You had to make the paper first, and then you had to make a certain type of paper. It was more like a blotting paper. It was not a bond paper like you would write on. It was more like a blotting paper, and that's what was used then in the manufacture of fiber. So the first fiber mill in York Glen was built in 1901, and is the closest building here to the museum of the mill complex right down here. However, they soon outgrew that and needed more room, so they bought another farm farther downstream, and that's where the main plant of National Vulcanized Fiber was built, called NVF today. Been out of the family since 1953, so I can't say much about it because I don't know much about it, but it was a family business originally, and that's and this house was kind of the residence of my grandfather and then later my father. My uncle got married first, so he wanted his own home, of course, and it was built on the hill on the other side of the mills. And so then when my father was married, why, he bought the house from his mother, or bought out the other siblings, and my father and mother moved in here in 1921. Well, now my dad and his cars, as I said, he was always quite mechanical, and he loved the steam engines in the mill. He loved steam power, understood it, as many people did in those days, because it was second nature to them. And so about 1904, maybe a little before that, but right around that time, he bought a little Orient buckboard, which was a tiny little car with, I guess, a one-cylinder gas engine, and he converted that to a steamer. Well, I don't know how successful it was, but that was the first steamer he ever had. And then he started to read about the Stanleys. And I'll tell you a little more about the Stanleys a little later. But my father got his first Stanley in 1908, which was a used car. It was a 1906 model. Here's a picture of it taken in front of the building right up here where we still have our shop and the house in the background. And that car has a left-hand drive, which is unusual for cars, for Stanley cars anyway, of that period. Well, for all cars of that period. Most of them were right-hand drive. And I think the reason it was left-hand drive, it may have been built for track racing. The H5s, which that's a model, what was called a Gentleman Speedy Roadster, they were pretty fast. And all the cars that were normally built for track racing had a left-hand drive because they always raced counterclockwise, and I guess the driver always wanted to be on the inside. So they would build them either way. If anybody wanted a left-hand drive car, they'd build them that way. But the standard car until 1915, when the Stanleys had right-hand steering or right-hand drive. So my dad had one, then he had another. And then in 1910, he wanted to know, I guess he was interested in selling them. So I suppose he wrote up there. It wasn't hard in those days to become a dealer. You didn't have to have very fancy credentials. Floyd Clymer out in Colorado was a dealer at age 11. Floyd put out some wonderful motor scrapbooks in later years. You're probably familiar with them, Gene. And I had the privilege of knowing Floyd a little bit in the 1940s and early 50s. He was a very interesting man. But he had a dealership for 2 or 3 different makes of cars in 1906, I think it was, when he was 11 years old. Anyway, my dad got a dealership in 1910, and I guess people around these parts, a few Stanleys had been sold in this area anyway. They had an agent in Philadelphia, D. Walter Harper, and Harper had sold a few cars, and so my father said that he had 53 cars running in this area about 1913 or 14, which I think was the high point, at least for him, in selling Stanleys. He got the dealership in 1910. I suppose, like anything, when it's new, you have a lot of enthusiasm for it. And he probably sold a good many cars at the beginning. Also, he used to tell me he could have sold more if he could have gotten them. They were sort of back ordered. And the Stanleys never liked to advertise. They always figured the car should do its own advertising. And I guess they wanted to make them by hand, and they didn't want to make more than 600 or 800 a year. However, I think if they could have made twice that many, they would have been delighted. I mean, if they could have sold twice that many. So it's hard to say what the reasons were. But anyway, my guess is if my father sold 10 a year, it was a good many. But he said he had 53 running at one time. This was his bill head, which 191 tells you when it was supposed to be used, and that's just about the time he had the dealership. They never had a showroom. They never had an inventory of cars to show people. My father always had one or two so he could give people a demonstration. And he said in those days too, one of the tricks, an awful lot of people didn't own automobiles, but they loved to have a ride. So one of the tricks was they would call up the dealer and say they were interested in buying one, they'd like him to come and give them a ride. So time would be set, usually on a weekend or Sunday when they weren't working, and my dad would go and take the people for a ride, and of course found out that in many cases they didn't have the wherewithal or no thought at all of buying a car. They just wanted the Sunday ride. So he got a little tired of that after a while, but that's one of the things I'm sure all dealers were up against, the same thing in those days. My dad loved steam and loved Stanleys, and I used to get the most out of them. He was a fairly fast driver. Well, he was young, and most young people were fairly fast drivers. But he told me that the Model K that he had, got that in 1910, that's a 30 horsepower, 3-passenger car, really 2, but it has a little folding back seat. And I have one down here, which are parts of it are the original car my father had in 1910. Other parts have had to be built new. But anyway, he said he drove that car 5 miles in 4 minutes on a road up near Quarryville. There must have been a road there that was exceptionally good for those days. You could drive that fast, but that's averaging 72 miles an hour for 5 miles. So that's not bad. We don't do quite that well today with the Stanleys. But anyway, that's how it went in the old days. In 1916 or 17, my father got interested in the twin-six Packards. And Packard had come out with a 12-cylinder car in 1915. A number of other manufacturers also went to multi-cylinder cars about that time. Cadillac pioneered the V8 in 1914. Buick built a V12, not many, they built some about 1915. Pathfinder built a V12, and there were quite a few cars like that. Then when 1920 came along, in the 20s, they got away from the except for Cadillac, they stuck with it. But there were very few V engines built in the 30s. Of course, Ford came out with V8 in 32. Walt's father had a Lincoln Zephyr, which Walt got the most out of when he was about 17, 18. And he went around a lot of curves on two wheels. I saw him do it.
Truth
Didn't
comes
take
out.
off altogether sometimes. The Lincoln Zephyr was a pretty snappy car. But, and then of course, there were in the 30s some 12s and even 16s built, but the early Packard Twin 6 or V12s, they called them Twin 6. That was the only thing Packard built for about 5 years. They didn't go to 6 or an 8 at that time, and they were very smooth for a gas car. My dad got interested in them. Of course, it was a lot easier with electric starters and everything that went with it than it was to fire up a Stanley. So he kind of got away from the Stanley. So when I grew up, we didn't have any steam cars around here. I grew up with Packards. My dad was interested in the Packard agency in Wilmington with Frank Diver, and so we had a new Packard every couple of years, and I didn't think they cost my dad very much because he could buy them at dealer's cost, and he always took good care of his cars. But even so, cars depreciated worse then than they do now, I think, especially the big cars. And I remember seeing Packards that cost $3,000 new maybe, or $3,500, 3 years old, looking like brand new, but the styles were changing pretty fast. They couldn't sell them for $500. So they really, there was some wonderful buys out there, but the Depression was on and nobody had $500. So that was part of it. Got away from steam a little bit right there. But the Stanleys, the last of the Stanleys were built in 1924. I'm going to tell a little history of Stanleys in a minute. That's more or less the history of the Marshalls and how we got here, how we got on this property, how steam cars came to this property. I mentioned that my dad never had a showroom for the Stanleys. They obviously had to service them and work on them. And he usually had one of the fellows down at the mill to help him. And they would work on them both here in this building wasn't built yet, but the one above, which was the old carriage house and stable, which had been converted to a garage. They'd work on them in there and also down at the mill. And we had a shop down there where they'd work on them. In 1940, I guess my father had really never forgotten the Stanleys and how much fun he had with them, and wondered if he couldn't maybe he would like to get one again. So one of the cars he'd sold when it was new was the Model 76, which is a 1913 20 horsepower Touring, and he'd sold it to a man named John Becker. And John lived just 2 miles up Red Clay Creek at that time when he bought the Stanley new, and he used it for 6 years. And he only drove it about 1,500 miles a year because it had 9,000 miles at the end of the 6 years. So in 1919, he laid it up. He always kept it in a closed garage, not a heated place, but a closed garage. And he moved up onto Route 41, and Ken will know where this is, where Johnny Springer is now. Johnny's his grandson. Toward Avondale, a little farther from here, but he took the Stanley with him and put it in a garage up there. And so my father heard that there were some young fellows around Kennett Square that were trying to buy the car from John Becker. And he said, those boys wouldn't know how to do anything with a steamer. They don't know anything about steam cars. He said, maybe I'll go up and see if John will sell it to me. Well, he went up and talked to him, and John wanted $150 for it. And, you know, that sounds dirt cheap, but it was too much money in 1940. It really was, but my dad bought it. And, of course, hindsight would say it's not too much money, you know. Too bad he didn't buy 100 of them. But, you could buy a Model T anywhere from 5 to 25 at that time. Walt remembers that. 15 was about the average price for a Model T.
$15.
So we thought 50 was about right, maybe for a Stanley, not 150. But anyway, you had to pay 150. But it was a beautiful car. I mean, original. Never been messed up, never been tampered with. And my father brought it home, and wasn't long before he had it running. We went into the inspection lane. I wanted him to wait till Saturday so I could go with him, and he said he would, and the lane was open Saturday mornings in those days. It really wasn't a lane like we have now. You had to go into the motor vehicle department. It was over on Concord Avenue. And so my father thought, well, he hadn't driven the car much yet. He didn't really want to go right through Wilmington, so we go across through Centerville and over toward Concord Pike and come down McKees Hill down to Concord Avenue where the department was. That's what we did. And I rode with him, and we had quite a nice trip, no trouble. But I remember some people along the way quite surprised. We came across some college fellows putting in fence posts over there on Center Meeting Road, Richard, just off of Kenneth Pike, and there's kind of a cut there where the road is, and the fence is quite a bit up above the cut. So when we came back, it was a cool morning, it was early spring, I think, and we came back through that cut, and the vapor was flying up to these fellows up there, and they didn't know what to make of it. Let out a war whoop, and one fellow, I think, turned a somersault. And so in the early days, you had a lot of interesting things. Some derogatory, and some were very complimentary. A lot of people would just laugh when they'd see an old car go by. Some would think it was hilarious, just break up. Well, anyway, he got this 1913 running, and then Pearl Harbor came along, and I guess really before that, he thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if he could have a modern car to run on steam? And he had a 1940 Packard, which he'd driven for a year and a half, I guess, and he thought, well, I'm going to convert it to a steam car. And how he ever got enough parts and enough components and everything assembled that fast, I don't really know. But in the winter of 41, 42, he took the motor and the transmission and everything out of the 8-cylinder Packard, and he put a steam plant in it. Well, in some ways it was very much like a Stanley system. A couple of things were different. It had a different type of boiler than a Stanley. It had a water tube boiler. And we can tell you more about that car. In fact, we can show it to you because we bought it back about 3 months ago. Anyway, it's up in the other building, and hasn't run for years, but we may get it running again. But it did have a Stanley engine and Stanley pumps, and that was all substituted for the original power plant. And a little hard to do because of clearances. By 1940, cars weren't nearly as high as they were in the Stanley days, so there wasn't a whole lot of vertical room for the engine under the floorboard and all, but it's in there. And it's a water tube boiler instead of a Stanley type boiler. And now the burner is different. It has an atomizing burner on it. We're not sure how satisfactory that'll be, but we're going to try to make it work. That project was either not very satisfactory, although I thought he did a nice job on it, or else my father just lost interest in it. But instead of really working with that car a long time, he decided he would buy a couple condensing Stanley cars, the latest of the Stanleys, which was mid-1920s, and they were less than 20 years old then, and kind of antiquated looking because styles were changing pretty fast, but still there were a few cars running that were almost that old on the road every day. So it turned out pretty practical because the one of those two that he bought in 1942 I still have, and it's a car that my dad used, I won't say every day, but used at least a couple times a week during World War II when gasoline was rationed. Kerosene, which the Stanleys burned, kerosene was rationed also, but since it really wasn't in demand that much, I mean, there weren't any jet airplanes yet, and they didn't, kerosene was still kind of a byproduct, so he went to the ration board and they gave him a liberal ration of kerosene, which meant that he could use the Stanley more than he could use the gas cars, where they had strict rationing on fuel. So the 740, the one that Jerry Lucas, I think, is working on tonight down there, the newest Stanley that I have, is the one my father used almost daily during World War II. Well, I guess the bug must have bit him because he kept looking and hunting for Stanleys, and by the end of the war, even though they weren't here yet, he had picked up or purchased another 5 or 6 and had them stored all over different places. Some were bought in New England, a couple were bought in Pennsylvania, and they hadn't been moved yet, but the people were anxious to get them out, and so in 1947, after the war was over, this building was built to house the growing collection of Stanleys and other cars which my father was collecting. And when it was first built, it seemed very big. You know, how we ever going to fill it with cars? But within a year or two, I think there were about 40 cars in here. They weren't. Most of them were unrestored, and most of them wouldn't run. But my father was pretty fast at mechanically restoring these cars. He never did much cosmetic work, but he would get a car going in he used to say he could restore it in 3 weeks. Well, you know, you can get them running in 3 weeks, and that's what he meant. But what he did, he would do well. It wasn't just wired together. I mean, you might have to do some engine work. Sometimes you didn't have to do much engine work. Very often had to either retube a boiler or put a new boiler in. There weren't many new boilers then. Tires were a big problem in the early years of collecting. In fact, that really held back the hobby in the 40s was a lack of tires. People would, well, of course, rationing during the war, but before and after the war, a lot of tours could have been run, but people didn't have rubber that would hold up to run their cars. But James Melton, who was a famous radio singer, tenor, Metropolitan Opera, I think, originally, and then he got into movies a little bit, and then he had a radio show, and Ford Motor Company was one of his sponsors, and Ford and Firestone and all those people worked closely together, and so through Melton's influence, the Firestone people agreed to make antique tires again in certain sizes, and they made about 6 sizes. Well, it wasn't all the sizes we needed, but at least it was 6 sizes we didn't have before for new tires, and they weren't the best tires in the world. We called them non-skid tires because the tread said non-skid on it, and it was a rounded tread. But they really didn't use very good rubber. I think they must have used reclaimed rubber or something, and the tires didn't wear very well. But if you didn't drive too many miles, at least you had new tires and they weren't going to blow out on you all the time. And so that was a big help. But many cars had the wheels changed to a size where you could get tires for that rim size. And it wasn't until the mid-1950s, really, that other people, mainly Gehrig first and then Some others got into making even more sizes, and they made really better tires, rib tread tires and all, which we've been lucky enough to have ever since. So the tire problem did a little bit hold back the antique car hobby, but even so, in 1946 they established the revival of the old Glidden tours, which were a progressive tour. The old ones were and the new ones were, where you started one place and ended somewhere else, and moved every day and stayed at a different hotel or something every night. Usually, sometimes you'd have 2 nights at one place. That's what we call a progressive tour, as opposed to a hub tour, where a hub tour you stay the same place for 4 or 5 days and just make day trips out. Easier, not as pioneering, but a lot easier. You don't have to carry your luggage, and today we all have trailers that take our cars to the hub and then park our trailers there. We can keep fuel and tools and things like that in the trailer that we don't need each day. A lot easier, as I say, makes it more fun that way, but not as pioneering, not the way they used to do it in the old days. Well, the early tours were always progressive, where you did have to move every day. Well, anyway, maybe I'm getting off the subject here, but trying to say how we got into it in the collecting period when these cars were antique cars. My father was not only interested in steam or in Stanleys, but I think that was no doubt his prime interest. He loved them, he understood them, he never had any trouble with them. He helped a lot of people learn about their cars, people who had Stanleys. And he and Earl Eckel, who lived up in North Jersey, 100 miles north of us, had both been dealers back in the days when these cars were made. And Earl was another collector, had 3 or 4 Stanleys. His most famous one was a 1914 Roadster, which he drove all over the eastern part of the country, and he drove that car about 150,000 miles. And he had taken that one in trade when he'd been a dealer. He was a dealer a little bit later than my father was. I think he was a dealer probably right up until the Stanleys stopped production in 1924. But about 1919, he sold a new car to somebody, and he took this 14 Roadster in trade, and he kept it. And that's the one he used in the antique car days for all his traveling. Meets were a little more common than tours, where you went to a meet and displayed the car. Everybody used to drive to the meets because, as I said, they didn't really have trailers in those days, and you'd drive them over the road. If you didn't, you'd have to either get them trucked there, or sometimes they would even be towed with a self-steering tow bar on the back of the car. We towed several Stanleys in here on the back of that 37 Packard. There's 2 self-steering tow bars upstairs, which I'd be delighted to give away if anybody wants one. Pretty handy at the time before the trailers came on. But the Glidden tour in 1946 was the beginning really of the tours. And the old Gliddens, which had been run from 1905 until 1913, were for the purpose of promoting the reliability of the automobile. People had a lot of doubts in the early years whether these things were really reliable, whether they could go on a trip and make it, whether they really were safe enough for somebody to own one. So the early tours were to promote the reliability of the cars, and the various manufacturers like Pierce Arrow and the White people who built the White steamers and many others would actually enter cars as company cars, you might say, to hoping that they could do very well on these tours, and that would be a good sales pitch for their car. And the White steamers did do well. The Stanleys never entered their cars on the Glidden tours. I think they knew they couldn't compete because of the water problem, having to stop for water so much, and in some parts of the country not even being able to get good water. So they never entered, and they entered a lot of hill climbs, they entered racing contests, which I'll talk about and get into Stanley history, but not the Glidden Tours. Pierce Arrow, the Pierce company up in Buffalo, entered a lot of cars on the Glidden Tours and did very well, won a lot of prizes. And that was a great sales tool for selling their cars. And so in the late 40s, after World War II, the idea of reviving these Glidden Tours, not now to prove the reliability of anything, but just as a fun thing where cars of the original Glidden age would be used and driven on tours and have some competitions and some prizes and that kind of thing. So that started in 1946 and it's still running today. I think they've had a Glidden Tour every year since, the Glidden Tour revival. They have been hub tours though since about the mid-50s, except there have been some exceptions there. There were a couple of tours in there that were not hub tours after that. But mostly they're all hub tours. It's just not practical today to do it any other way. The tours are too large to get accommodations for everybody if you move every night. And the traffic is just too bad sometimes to do that. So that they'd rather go to a place where everybody can be taken care of and take their trailers, as I just mentioned, and makes it easier, makes it more fun, and that's really why we're doing it, for fun. We're not doing it because we have to do it. So my father and I loved the Glidden Tours in the late 40s and 50s, and we went on, I think I only missed one in about 10 years. And he went for 9 or 10 years until he didn't feel like doing it anymore. And we always took usually 2 Stanleys. He'd drive one, I'd drive one. We had a neighbor here, Roy Benge, who lived, he was superintendent of the mill right down here, and he lived right back here. His father had owned a Stanley. In fact, he'd had 3 of them, not at one time, but I mean when they were being made. And Roy wanted one like one of the cars he had remembered his father had, and it had to be a 1915 Touring. Well, we didn't have too much trouble finding one for him, and he bought it. And it turned out that was the only 1915 that has ever turned up, with the exception of mountain wagons. And he didn't realize he had anything that scarce. But anyway, he drove it on a number of the tours, enjoyed it very much. So he and my father and I would very often go, and sometimes we had as much fun going and coming from the tours as we did on the tour itself, because, well, for example, we went to Lake Placid one time, 3 days driving up there, or 2.5, and then the tour ended in Rochester, and we drove home in a couple of days, and so you had a lot of experiences going and coming as well as on the tour itself. Those days are gone, but it was a lot of fun. The collection here went from, I mentioned about 40 unrestored cars at the high point. My dad gradually got the ones that he liked restored and sold some of the duplicate models. He had 5 1918 Stanleys at one time. I think every one of them was a 7-passenger Touring, and so we kept the nicest one, and the other 4 were sold off, that sort of thing. But and he had some other cars, several Packards. We had several other makes of steam cars. Had a Locomobile at one time. Had a couple white steamers. We had a couple Doble steamers. We had Toledo steamer. I guess that's about it. When my father died, I think he still had 34 cars. That was in 1969. And Weldon Stump and I thought we would like to open here to the public and feature steam. So I got rid of an awful lot of, well, most of the cars that were not steam powered in 1970 and 71, and we got ready to open up, which we did in 71, to the general public. And we still kept other makes of steamers. We had the white steamers, and we had the Dobles, and the Toledo was still here. But we still featured Stanleys, and we always had a Stanley running when we were open, usually one of the mountain wagons to give, I had two at that time, I have one now, to give rides around the yard here. And then, of course, we ran the little railroad outside, which was a big draw for the kids. The collection, I think I've been trying to upgrade it ever since, and the original leather in these cars lasted pretty well for about 50 years, but it won't last for 90 years, so it's been replaced in all but one, and we're kind of gradually doing that one this winter. The seat cushions are now at an upholstery shop being done. So the collection has changed some over the years, and but after Weldon Stump retired in 1986, I sort of became overprotective of the collection. I thought, well, you know, by that time I had just about the same cars I have now. I had sold off just about everything but the Stanleys and two Packards and an electric car back in the corner. They're still here. Everything else was gone. But I thought, well, I want to keep the Stanley collection together because I know more about Stanleys than I do the others, and enjoy driving them, enjoy taking them on tours. But I got sort of overly protective and didn't want other people to drive my cars. I didn't think they really understood them and knew that much about them. And so consequently, I like to tell people I used every car every year, but I didn't. I couldn't get 14 of them and use them all every year. I might use 5 or 6 in a year and then change a little bit the next year, but you always had favorites, so some of them got used more than others. So that's how the idea for this course came about. I had been talking to my wife a good while about needing to get younger people interested in the hobby, and that was the only justification for keeping the collection together. And she kept nudging me a little bit and said, "You've been talking about it, when are you going to do it?" And I hesitated a while longer. And finally, just 3 years ago, I finally got a list together of some people I thought would be interested, and we called them together in a group like tonight, and we had about 10 people there at the first meeting, and I sort of presented this idea, which is on the sheet that circulated to you folks tonight. That's 3 years old, but I thought you might like to have it because some of the concepts of the thing are still the same. So, you know, we knew if this was successful at all, we'd get some people interested. We'd try to have a few lectures first to explain how the Stanleys work, and after the lecture series, then we'd get into the driving a little bit on one-on-one or one-on-two basis. And the group grew from about 10 at that first meeting to something like 18, and that's about where it's been ever since, around that number. But we do have a few drop out, and people get busy with other things. And so that's why we thought we'd like to bring some new people in and more or less try to keep the group at about 20. That's a nice manageable size, and it allows for 5 or 6 teams of fellows to work on projects, maybe about 3 on a team, this sort of thing. Maybe one has more experience than the other 2, and he can bring the others along. And I think most of the fellows have enjoyed it. Some of them have, of course, offered to teach these other aspects of the thing, starting 2 weeks from tonight, so that I won't have to do it all, and they'll be better teachers anyway. So I'm pleased at this point as how it's gone. I know some nights when we've had work nights, it might have been easier at my age to sit in the house and put my feet up, and I had to come out because the fellows were here, but that's good for me. Keeps me going. Good for me. And I hope you'll keep coming. So that was sort of the basis for how the course began. And we'll have a little time here for questions and answers. I've talked an hour straight here, so that's pretty heady stuff when you don't have a break for an hour. But what I want to cover before we end tonight is the history of the Stanleys themselves, and then of the cars and so forth. And maybe we ought to take a little intermission right now if you want, 5 minutes. Any questions or anything? We can do that.
There he goes, there he goes.
Before we go on, there are sheets here on the next 3 lectures, one on boilers, one on burners, one on engines. And you're welcome to pick them up tonight, but you don't have to. Maybe you'd rather have them the night that this subject's being talked about. Well, I'd like to tell you a little about the Stanley twins and the Stanley steamers and the whole setup there. And we now have a Stanley Museum, which is sort of dedicated to their memory and all the things they accomplished during their lifetimes. The Stanley family was from Maine, at least from about the 1820s on. They lived in Maine. Not quite sure where they were before that. But the twins themselves, who built the Stanley steamers, were born in Kingfield, Maine in 1849. They had 1 older brother, they had 4 younger brothers, and 1 younger sister. So it was a large family, and quite spread out in age. I think there was at least 20 years difference between the oldest and the youngest of the siblings. They got into all kinds of enterprises. They were pretty intelligent boys when they were young, and they worked together on almost everything. And around Kingfield, people didn't know their names, they just called them the twins. The first enterprise they were ever in was the sugaring business, maple sugaring. That was a big thing up in that country, and they made enough money to get down to Farmington and buy some cloth so their mother could make them suits and things like that. Well, anyway, both of them did pretty well in school, and they went to the Farmington Normal School, which was about 24 miles from Kingfield. It's now part of the University of Maine. They call it University of Maine at Farmington now. But it was called a normal school then, which was mostly a school to teach school teachers, as you know. They dropped out, both of them did, for different reasons. The reason F.E. dropped out, one day the teacher asked him to draw a map of the United States. And he did, and all the other kids in the class did. And his was so perfect, the teacher was sure he had cheated, that he had copied it. He had a map hidden somewhere and he copied it. Well, he hadn't. He'd done it from memory. but the teacher, you know, insisted, and they just fell out, and F.E. Stanley didn't want any more of it, so he left school. Well, in those days, it wasn't too hard to get a job teaching school. Sometimes it seems to me that maybe the smartest kid in the class, when they got to be 13 or 14, they became the teacher of the class. Seemed that it was almost the way in some of those country schools. You think that's right, Richard?
Yeah, it is what happened.
Yeah. So, F.E. Stanley was a principal of the school before he was 20 years old. And his wife, his future wife, started teaching when she was about 15. And they met at the same school when they were maybe 19 or something. And they were married when they were 20 or 21. Well, anyway, he was a teacher to begin with. Let me take each twin separately. F.E., Francis Edgar, was the inventive genius. Most of the things that were patented and that happened with the automobiles, before that with the photographic process, and were F.E.'s ideas. But with the exception of one or two patents, every patent was in joint name, F.E. and F.O. They were inseparable. What one did, the other did, and they got along very fine. The wives didn't get along quite as well. That's another story. Anyway, so F.E. Got tired of school teaching, I guess, and became an artist. And he was doing portraits mostly, charcoal portraits. And he invented an airbrush. He had a patent on that in 1876, which I guess what you did was coat your paper or whatever with charcoal, and then with this airbrush, you blew off the charcoal to make the white or the tones that you wanted, and made your portrait that way. So he was a portrait photographer and a charcoal portrait, not photographer, but artist. Well, his subjects had to sit so long for the portrait, 2 or 3 hours, that he thought if he could get a decent photograph of them, he could work from the photograph and he wouldn't have to have them sit there. So that's how he got interested in photography. The film that was available, and it was not roll film in those days. The film was on glass plate negatives. I guess you wouldn't call it film, but it was a negative. And glass plate negatives had been around since the beginning of photography in the 1840s. Originally, they had to do all their developing and chemical work in the field. But then with the advent of the dry plate, they could put the emulsion on the glass plate in a laboratory or in a dark room, spread it evenly, and then they had plate holders where the glass plate slid inside of a couple of opaque boards, you might call it, which made the plate holders. So you load up several of these plate holders and put them in a case and carry that out to wherever you wanted to take your pictures with you. And then your camera, and of course with a big thing too, and most photographers had a couple younger people carrying all their equipment into the field because it was so heavy. But at least you could take the picture, you'd slide the plate in the back of the camera, then you'd pull the cover away from it, or the plate holder, leaving the negative to be exposed in there, the glass itself. Take your picture and push your plate back in, so when you pulled the whole thing out, the light wouldn't hit it. And you put it in your case and take it back to the dark room and develop it. Well, anyway, Stanley's didn't invent any of that, but F.E. got interested in photography because of his charcoal work, and then wasn't satisfied with the type of glass plates he could buy. So he developed a process for putting the emulsion on the glass plate more evenly, and got that patented. And invited his brother to come into business with him. That was about 1884. So what did F.O. do up to that time? Well, F.O., Freeland Oscar Stanley, the other one, he wasn't exactly lacking in brains either, but he wasn't the inventive genius that his brother was. But he had a stint at school teaching too, and he went down to Mechanic Falls, Maine, and met a young lady there. They were married, and he started making mechanical drawing instruments to sell to the schools. I suppose we'd call them technical high schools today or something, where they taught mechanical drawing, as they used to call it, engineering drawing, whatever. But some of those instruments from the back 100 years ago were really beautiful things, in nice cases, and all the dividers and the compasses and all the things you had in a case of instruments like that. So F.O. was making them in Mechanics Falls, but he wasn't doing too well with that. He was making a living, but he really wasn't getting ahead. So F.E. decided he invited his brother to come in with him on this dry plate manufacturing, and so that's when they got together again in 1884. And from that time on, they were pretty much in business together for the rest of their lives, as long as they both lived, except for the hotel in Colorado, which I'll tell you about too. Anyway, they were very successful with the photographic dry plates. They were not the only company doing it. There were many small companies, and even several in the state of Maine doing it. And they were in Lewiston, Maine at that time, where Bates College is now. And F.E. had a photographic studio in Lewiston too, but that's where they manufactured the dry plate. But the glass had to be sent up from Boston. They had to buy their chemicals down there somewhere. And then the markets for the dry plates were Boston, New York, Philadelphia, not up in Maine. I mean, we couldn't sell them up there. So they decided they'd be better off if they moved to the Boston area. So in 1890, they moved down to the suburbs of Boston, Newton, Massachusetts, actually Watertown, but Newton was a more prestigious residential development, so they always used Newton for their address. They were about 2 blocks from Newton. They were in Watertown, and that's where the dry plates were made, and they became what we'd call newly rich, or nouvelle rich, or some such name that people use for first generation families that have made a lot of money. Anyway, they did make a lot of money. It was said that they each took out something like $400,000 a year out of that dry plate business, and no taxes, of course, in those days. And that would be what, 20 times that today, probably. So they were doing very well. They built themselves large homes in Newton. They were interested in music. They were interested in the fine arts. They were very well-rounded people, actually. And they had been approached by George Eastman to sell out. He was buying up a lot of the little dry plate companies around, had bought several of them, and wanted to buy the Stanleys. Well, the Stanleys had about 18% of the total market, I think, at that time. This is late 1890s now, on dry plates. And Eastman wanted 100%. Of course, he never got 100%, but he was like General Motors. He got most of it at one time. And sell, and they wouldn't talk about selling, and Eastman decided, well, they didn't advertise much either, the Stanleys didn't, so he could probably force them out of business and dwindle their share of the market. Well, in the next 3 or 4 years, they went from 18% to 22%. So they were gaining on it. Well, I don't think they ever would have sold except they got interested in building automobiles. And how did that happen? Well, the story is that F.E.'s wife was a large woman. Well, we know that. That's not a story. And he tried to, they were very close couple. They liked to do things together. And he tried to teach her to ride a bicycle so they could ride together. Well, she didn't master that. She crashed, and that was sort of the end of that. So then, and he didn't like horses. And of course, a lot of people didn't like horses, but they thought, I think most people thought they were locked into this for till the end of time. I mean, how long had they put up with horses and carriages? Hundreds of years. Improved a little bit, but not improved much over all that time. So that's one story we hear of why F.E. got interested in building a horseless carriage. He didn't like buggies, he didn't like to have horses to tend to. Anyway, he put together a little car in 1897, supposedly that maybe he and Mrs. Stanley could ride around the streets of Newton in. And his brother, F.O., saw this little car and he wanted one just like it. So together they put together a second one, just about like it. So now they had two and they could race each other. And so since they looked exactly alike and the cars looked exactly alike, that one would fly down the street much faster than the speed limit would allow, and a good officer of the law would try to catch up with this fellow and get him stopped, and before he caught up with him, he comes by again. So the policeman thought, well, was his brother or what? They used to do things like that all the time, apparently, and had a lot of fun with it. It was also said that if a salesman was in the office and one of the Stanleys got tired of talking to him, he'd say, excuse me just a minute. Go in the back and his brother would come out and the first one would go and have his lunch. The salesman thought he was talking to the same guy. Twins can do this, and I'm sure there are a lot of twins today. But, twins either get along very well with each other or they don't get along at all with each other. And I've seen both in twins, but I think more times than not they're very close to each other. Stanley certainly were. But they were running these two little cars around Newton, and there was to be an automobile show in Mechanics Hall in Boston. And so the Stanleys went down to see what was down there. They didn't take the car down, but they looked around, and somebody recognized them there, and they said, well, Mr. Stanley, whichever one they were talking to, there's going to be a contest over at Charles River Park in 2 or 3 days to see how these little cars will do around the track, and they're even going to build an incline to see if they can climb this incline. Well, why don't you bring one of your little cars over? Well, they did, and they did so well over there that they went around the track, and this is 1898 now, so this is pretty far back, and averaged almost 30 miles an hour going around the track in this little, looked like this. That was the first car. You've seen that picture or one like it and many times been circulated. And then there was an incline there, and none of the cars had been able to get up the incline more than about halfway, and they had built it so that the top slope was steeper than the rest of it. And so F.E. was behind the tiller and F.O. was standing alongside, and F.O. said to they had several men there to help the cars down, and so that nobody, they didn't have brakes, they could let them down easy and that kind of thing. And these were little tiny cars, they weren't very heavy. And so F.O. said, well, you better get all the way up the top. My brother's going to the top. Well, they didn't believe him. F.E. did go to the top. Here he is way up here. Nobody to hold him back because these fellows are all the way down the ramp. And so he held the car. So the story goes with steam, kept a little the throttle open a little bit until they got up there to let him back down. Well, they had so many orders at the end of that day to build cars. And they had 8 or 10 people that ordered one right there. Said, you've got to build it. You've got to build it. And so they decided maybe then we'd go in the automobile business, and that was the beginning of it. They decided, and each one was a little bit improved from the one before. By this time they only built 2 or 3 cars, but they were making little improvements. And they decided to build 200 cars just alike. This is about the beginning of 1899. So they ordered parts, and some of the things they made themselves, some were made other places, and a lot of the parts were on hand, and they started putting together. And then they were approached to sell the business. And John Brisbane Walker, who owned Cosmopolitan magazine in New York, had read about the Stanleys and heard about them, came up there and said, I want to buy your automobile business. And the Stanley said, well, we really don't have a business yet. You've got a wonderful product here and I want to buy it. So they got their heads together and they decided, well, maybe we've got a fish on the hook here. Let's quote him. Let's quote him a lot of money. He won't go for it, but if he does. So they said, well, all right, $250,000. So Walker said, would you give me 30 days to raise it? And the Stanley said yes. So at the end of 30 days, Walker begged for a little more time. He said, I'm making out all right, but he said, would one of you come down to New York with one of your little cars and demonstrate it to the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and some of these people, because I really need that kind of money to come up with $250,000. So this time it was F.O., and he said, yeah, I'll do it. So he took the car down to New York and went up the Hudson to Tarrytown, where these estates were, and was demonstrating the car quite successfully. But I think it was one of the Vanderbilts, Walker insisted that he wanted to give Vanderbilt the demonstration. Well, Walker didn't know anything about how to run the car, so they took off sort of with Mr. Stanley's, he didn't exactly think they'd make out too well. But anyway, they took off and went up the road, but they didn't make out very well. Didn't get back, and had to get a team of horses to bring them back. Well, Vanderbilt was not impressed, and so that deal fell through. So after a couple of days down there, and the attempts did not look like they were satisfactory, and Mr. Walker said, well, Mr. Stanley, I don't know what to tell you, but there's not much use of you staying around anymore. We'll be glad to take care of your expenses. And F.O. said, well, he said, I've enjoyed it. He said, it's all right, I'll get back home, no harm done. So he drove the little car back to Boston or back to Newton. And that may have been the first trip in a Stanley car, I don't know. But anyway, within a matter of a few weeks, Walker was able to come up with the money. And so the Locomobile Company, I'm abbreviating here a little bit, some of you know the details, but the Locomobile Company of America was formed, moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, continued to and started to build steam cars on the Stanley patents. Used a lot of the parts that the Stanleys had for these first 200 cars that they were going to build. So many of the early locomobiles had Stanley gauges on and things like that. And the Stanleys, as part of the deal, agreed to stay on for a year, I think it was, with Locomobile. FE as sort of the mechanical advisor and FO as the marketing man. So because of that, FO drove a Locomobile, which was really a Stanley, but to promote Locomobile up Mount Washington on August the 31st, 1899. That's what we celebrated last summer up there, the 100th anniversary of that. Mrs. Stanley went with him, which was quite a feat too. Sue Davis of the Stanley Museum has made the most of that. But and also what else did he do that year? I guess the Mount Washington thing was the most important thing, but also did other racing, track racing and things like that to promote the Locomobile. Well, I mentioned Bridgeport. They made the first locomobiles at Newton because they bought the plant along with the deal when they bought the business. But they soon decided they'd move to Bridgeport, and they had no more use for the Newton plant. And the Stanleys had agreed to stay out of business, I believe, for 2 years when they, as a condition of the sale. So in 1901, 2 years after the sale, Locomobile no longer wanted the Newton plant. The Stanleys were free to go on their own again. They bought everything back there at Newton, including, well, the plant, and of course the business they didn't have to buy back because they had only agreed to stay out of business for 2 years, and paid $20,000 for it. They had sold for $250,000. They bought everything back for $20,000.
Wow.
They said they never could have made that much money out of making cars, and that pretty total. And in fact, they never made much money making cars any time, but they certainly made names for themselves. And they had a lot of fun doing it. The way they started to promote the cars was races and hill climbs, and that was quite important. I guess if you didn't want to spend a lot of money with paid advertising, if you could get a lot of free publicity because you won a race or won a hill climb, that's FO and his wife going up Mount Washington. Why, that gave you a lot of free publicity, which you needed in order to keep your name in front of the public. So the hill climbs were quite well known. There was the Dead Horse Hill Climb at Worcester, Mass., which was held every year. The Stanleys won that almost every year, I think. And then there was the Giant's Despair Hill Climb at Wilkes-Barre. They didn't always win, but they'd win in their class. In other words, they had different classes for different weights of the car and for the different amounts of power. And some of these European racing cars were very expensive and very heavy and very powerful. And they would beat the Stanleys, but when you came down to the weight of the car and the cost of the car, the Stanleys would win hands down. They also had the time runs up Mount Washington. The first trip, of course, FO wasn't competing against anybody. He just drove the first car up there, but it was a little over 2 hours. And within a few years, FE went up in 22 minutes in 1905 in a little car. We're not quite sure exactly what that car was. It was, I think it was between a 10 and a 20 horse car. It was really before they had started building 20 horse cars, at least putting them in the catalog. But anyway, it was a very good time for those years. And they did well at Wilkes-Barre, they did well on the Dead Horse. And then on the flat racing, they're most famous for Ormond Beach down in Florida. Some of the wealthy people who imported these European cars and all. It was sort of a social thing at first to invite their friends to come down where the beach was nice and flat and race on the beach. And this started about 1903 down there. Well, pretty soon it became an annual event that was open to anyone who wanted to enter. And the Stanleys first had a presence down there, either 1904 or 1905, but that's not where they made most of their fame. There was a fellow named Louis Ross who used to work for the Stanleys and then later built a little car called the Ross Steamer. He didn't build them very long, but he was kind of a racing car man, and he made some records down there, I believe in 1905. And then in 1906, the Stanleys took the car down that they had built just for racing down there. I think you've all seen pictures of it. If not, we have plenty of pictures back here. And that was called the Stanley Rocket, nicknamed the Stanley Cigar because it was kind of shaped that way, although it was more like an inverted canoe. And it was really an egg crate. It had no structural strength to the body. And it was all boiler and engine and one man sitting in there to run it. And the whole car only weighed 1,600 pounds. I guess that was without the driver maybe, but however they weighed it. And that was the lightest class because in that class you could go up to a long ton, I think they called it, which was about 2,200 pounds, something like that. But they were well under at 1,600. And in this car, a fellow, I think his name was Durbin, was supposed to be the racing car driver to get down there and race on the beach. Well, some of the times in the trials ahead of the actual day were pretty good. They were attaining speeds that had, really was sort of mind-boggling, over 100 miles an hour. And so Durbin got cold feet at the last minute, and he said, I can't do it. I'm just afraid to do it. So F.E. Stanley was down there. He says, well, I'm going to do it. And Mrs. Stanley said, no, you're not. So she won the day, and he didn't. But Fred Marriott was a mechanic in the Newton assembly plant, and he was down there to more or less to keep the car running. But Fred wasn't yet married, so Fred, you're the one. So Fred drove the car at 127 miles an hour, and of course made several other records within a day or two of that too. But that's the one that really stood out and was held as the fastest time for 4 years. It wasn't until 1910 that record was broken by Barney Oldfield. So that of course made the Stanleys got him a lot of publicity, and there was a young fellow here. He ended up being my father. When he read about the race down there, he just had to have a stand. That was all. So anyway, the Stanleys then, of course, their cars kept getting larger. They built, by 1908, they were offering 3 different sizes of engines and boilers. They called the smallest size 10 horsepower. The middle size was 20 and the large ones were 30. And probably 3/4 of their production, maybe even 80%, were the 10 horsepower cars because they were the cheapest ones, the more reasonable in the price range of more people. And we think in 1908 they built about 800 cars, which was probably their best production year ever. And they made more money in 1908 than any other year. And they built a lot of those little EX model cars. I have one here, and Gene Noddy's car here is the next year, 1909 model E2 they called it. A little bit bigger than the EX, but that was the next generation of that 10 horsepower car. And and so the EXs, if they, you know, if they represented 80% of 800 cars, they built 640 of them in 1 year. Actually, they had built that model for 2 or 3 years before that, so the total EX production would have been more, and probably more than any other model they ever made. Even though 1908 was their best year financially, I think along about 1912 or 13, all things taken into account, were the best cars they ever built. They were a little bit heavier and therefore didn't perform quite as well, perhaps, but they were more comfortable, they steered better, and they were still not all that heavy that they didn't perform well at all. When they got into the condensing car period, the cars were pretty heavy, and they still were only 20 horsepower. They didn't, no longer built the 10 or the 30 horsepower after 1915. Except for the mountain wagons. They built a few mountain wagons up until 1916, and they were all 30 horsepower. Well, F.O. Stanley became very ill from tuberculosis when he was just over 50 years old. And, he dropped down to less than 100 pounds in weight, and his doctors didn't give him very long to live. And but they told him maybe if he went to Colorado, and they thought Denver would be a pretty good place, that he might be better, and that might help him. So he and his wife went to Denver, I think 1903, and he was there 3 or 4 weeks, but he didn't seem to be a whole lot better. But then he heard that if he went even higher up in the mountains, it might work. So he went to Estes Park, and Estes Park wasn't much of a place then, but he was better up there, and he soon got the feeling a lot better. And so from that time on, I think he kept his home in Newton and would come back here in the wintertime, but for 6 or 8 months of the year he would stay in Colorado. So he was much less active in the automobile business after that than his brother F.E. was. But they were still partners 50-50, and everything they made or lost, it was a 50-50 proposition. F.O. did put a lot of his money into Estes Park. He bought a lot of real estate out there, which of course was cheap in those days to what it would be later. But and on one prime piece of real estate, he built a fine hotel. The Stanley Hotel was built in 1908-9. Took a couple of years to build it, and is still there and still in operation. It's kind of a miracle that it is. It's had quite a few owners in the past several years. Sometimes it's very well run, sometimes it isn't, but it continues. And there are some beautiful old things in that hotel because F.O. brought things out from the east and put some very nice things in there comparable to the best New England resort hotels. It looks like a New England resort hotel. It doesn't look like a lodge in the Rocky Mountains. But Herman was there within the last 6 or 8 months.
October '99.
October, yeah. It needs a lot, and I think it's maybe not as good now as when you were there, Herman, from what I hear. But hopefully somebody can turn it around. I don't know, but it has lasted a long time. Well, the Stanley Hotel and Estes Park were 20 to 25 miles from the nearest railhead, and everybody had to get there on the train in those days. So they had to have cars or some sort of vehicle, and by 1907 or 8 or 9, it would have been a car to get up there. And there was a livery company down in Loveland, Colorado, which was one of the railheads, called the Osmond Brothers, and they had bought several Stanley touring cars. We wondered why, but anyway, no doubt FO had something to do with that. And they were quite successful, but they wouldn't carry enough people. So FO came back and got together with his brother, and they designed a much larger car, which they called a mountain wagon, and started to build Stanley mountain wagons in 1909, about, I think, within a year after the hotel had opened. And the first wagons only had 3 seats. There were 9 passengers. And about 1911, they went to a 12-passenger mountain wagon, which had 4 seats. And most of them were built that way. The one I have is 5 seats, but they only built 3 or 4, we think, with 5 seats, if that many. And no doubt this one was built on special order by somebody who wanted 5 seats, and we have every indication that it was built at the factory that way. But the wheelbase is the same as the 4-seated wagons. It just has more overhang in the back. And they built about 300 mountain wagons over a 6-year period. Maybe as many as 100 of them went to Colorado to be used up there in connection with the Estes Park operation and a few other resort places out there. But most of them were sold in the Northeast to resort hotels in New England or in Pennsylvania. A lot of them in the White Mountains, some over in Vermont, some in Maine, and some in the Poconos and places like that. But altogether, about 300, and about 1916 was the last of them. F.E. Stanley was always a fast driver, and his wife would say to him, Frank, slow down, you're going too fast. And he would say, I'm not going a bit faster than you are. The 2 little tiller steer cars that I have out here, very interesting, because without a hood you don't have valves on the dash in front of you to work. The valve on the driver's side, the valves are right along the side of the seat where you can reach it. And one of those is to control your water pump, bypass your pump, or close it so it'll pump into the boiler. One of them is your burner valve, turn it on and off. One of them is your pilot valve. But on the fuel system, for these 2 valves, the fuel valves, the pilot and the main, to get any fuel, a valve over on the left side of the car has to be open. And I call that Mrs. Stanley's valve, because I figure he gets going too fast, she shuts him off. He's out of business. It doesn't matter what he does with it. Another really funny story about F.E. They had a summer place up on the coast of Maine, Squirrel Island, off of Booth Bay Harbor. And it was kind of an exclusive community, I guess, and I'm not sure, I guess there were a few automobiles on the island, but people didn't usually take their cars back and forth because of the ferry ride. Maybe they didn't have a ferry for cars really, but they would leave them at Booth Bay or one of the other places and just take the boat over the island. Well, F.E. apparently during the summer would be back and forth. He would be at the factory a good bit, and he'd get there once a week or something like that, and he would drive. And he was always a fast driver. That finally killed him when he had an auto accident in 1918. That was the end of him. But prior to that, he was always a fast driver. As I told you, he went up Mount Washington in 22 minutes. He wanted to drive the world record racer in Florida, but his wife wouldn't let him. And the story was he never drove a Stanley except at top speed as fast as it would go. Well, anyway, he had a son, Raymond, who was born kind of unexpectedly. His parents were both 45 when Raymond was born. So he was kind of a favorite son. Anything Raymond wanted, Raymond got, you know, and he grew up in a pretty wealthy family by that time. So when Raymond got the age where he could drive a car, you know, he had all these ideas for racers too, and they put something together for him at the factory that was what Raymond wanted. It wasn't a stock car, it was what Raymond wanted. One time they were all up at Squirrel Island, and Raymond and his father both were going back to Newton, and Raymond had his car up there, and F.E. had his car up there, and they got ready to go, and F.E. said, Raymond, you gonna go with me? You wanna take your own car? Well, of course he wouldn't take his own car. He's 17, 18 years old. He wouldn't take his own car. So F.E. said, okay, you can come along. I'm in a hurry. I'm gonna go. So F.E. took off and headed for Newton. Well, in those days you had to get through all the small towns on the way, and some of these towns had a racket of having a speed limit posted at 15 or something like that. And most people went through a little bit faster than that, so they got pulled over, and the justice of the peace would collect the $5 or $10 from them because they were speeding. So F.E. went through there too fast as usual, and he got pulled over, and the officer said, you gotta come with me down to the Justice of the Peace Court. And F.E. said, well, I'm in a hurry. He said, can't I just pay you, and you can take it down there and pay my fine for me? So the officer kind of scratched his head, and he said, I guess that'd be all right. It'd be $10. So F.E. gave him $20. And the officer said, well, why'd you give me $20? Well, he said, I'd tell you. He said, my son will be coming in a little while. And he said, he'll be going too fast too, I imagine. And if he is, why, you can pull him over, but tell him his fine is paid. And if he isn't, pull him over anyway and give him the $10. Raymond told me that story. He died at the age of 91 in 1985, and I met him several times just before that. I never had known him as a younger man, but he told me a lot of neat stories, and that was one of them. So the Stanleys were characters. They sold the automobile business in 1917, and F.E. lived about a year after that before he had the accident and was killed. And F.O., as I said, was in Colorado all during the summer, and he wasn't able to work at it year-round. So F.E. had two son-in-laws, and they, together with one other man, bought it, I'm sure on very favorable terms. But they had all kinds of ideas how they could sell steam cars starting in 1917. Well, it was a tough assignment. Steam cars were on their way out. The electric starters had come along for gas cars, especially the bigger ones, had electric starters, and that made all the difference in the world, really, for gas cars, that you didn't have to crank. And so they kept building the cars heavier and more comfortable and putting more refinements on, but really the performance was going down all the time because they were too heavy and they weren't putting more power in the cars. And gas cars were getting more powerful and more responsive all the time. So production did drop off, and but they stuck with it until 1924, and that was the last. They built about 100 cars in 1924, and the factory closed down. Some people tried to reorganize and build some cars after that, and a company was formed called the Steam Vehicle Company of America, and I believe the first of those cars, maybe all of them, were built in the old Stanley plant in Newton. And then the company moved to Chicago, and they always thought they were going to build cars or build buses out there, but they really never built anything. But they were, they were in business, and I found a copy of a letter here that my father, or maybe it was the reply, from the Stanley Steam Motors or whatever it's called in Chicago, written to my father in 1927. And I can't figure why he had any interest in 1927, because it was after he'd had any Stanleys in the old days and a long while before he got interested again. But anyway, apparently he had inquired about the purchase of a 30-horse boiler. And they said yes, they could supply it, and how much it would be. I don't think he ever bought one. I never heard anything, but I found this letter. So there was some semblance of a company out there, but they never really did anything. F.E. was working on self-propelled passenger cars, steam, when he died. 1917, 1918. And they built for the Boston Main Railroad about 4 of these unit, like a doodlebug, Steve, only instead of gasoline or diesel, it was steam, and it basically had a Stanley boiler, maybe 2 or 3 of them, or maybe something much larger in there. And I think they had a couple Stanley engines on the trucks, something like that. It was like, it was kind of like a doodlebug. It had a baggage compartment and a passenger compartment. And they used them up in New Hampshire on one of the branch lines on Boston, Maine. And a couple of those cars operated for several years, well up into the 1920s. But of course F.E. died right in the middle of the development of that, and nothing more ever came of it. And none of those cars ever survived. That's about all, I guess, on the Stanleys that I need to tell you. You can read voluminous material about them. There's 2 or 3 new books now being written that are not out yet. I guess the first one to come out will be the story of F.O. in Colorado wanted Bill, as you understand.
Yeah.
And maybe we ought to say a little about the Stanley Museum, you think, before we stop?
It would be nice. It was started in 1981 by a group of people interested in the hobby. Tom Marshall was one of them. Although Tom thinks I am not.
Not interested in the hobby?
No, I'm not a charter member.
Oh.
I think out of the group I've been a member longer than everybody but Tom, but not since 1981. They've done quite a bit to keep the hobby alive. They have a dynamic director that, without her prodding to the Stanley family, it never would have gotten off the ground. And she really is something. If you ever meet her, you'll be swept off your feet almost, the way she talks about the Stanleys and knows so much about them, can drive the automobiles, can work on the automobiles. It's a shame they're so far away from where we are. But they're in the hometown that the Stanleys grew up in. They own, as the Stanley Museum is a school that the Stanley brothers funded and had built for the town of Kingfield. And Sue Davis came along when they were ready to tear it down and got the town to give it to them. I think wasn't it for $1 or something? And then we spent the rest of the years just keeping it in repair. But she's really done a wonderful job with the organization. And they have quite a museum up there, not only of Stanley cars and memorabilia, but a lot of other things that the Stanleys were into that Tom didn't get into tonight, like the Stanley brothers were fine violin makers, which not everybody knows about. F.O. really did that, I guess, after they got out of the steam car business, until he was
Well, they were always whittlers, and they always liked music, and, I mean, you know, a lot of people were whittlers back in the 19th century. They keep a sharp pocket knife, and when they weren't doing anything else, they'd get a piece of wood and whittle. And sometimes it'd turn out something pretty nice, but they always wanted to make that violin as good as a Stradivarius. I don't know whether they ever quite accomplished that, but they made some pretty nice violins and really did it as a hobby. I don't think they ever made a business of it. However, they had a nephew named Carlton Stanley. Carlton was a son of their oldest brother. And Carlton worked for them, for the twins, for quite a while. In the early years of the Stanley Steamers, he went to Montreal to run the agency up there in Canada for them. He met a girl up there, and his wife was from Montreal. But anyway, in later years, Carlton had quite a violin business. And he sold them commercially. I don't know how many he made, but several hundred.
Did he really?
And a few of those violins have turned up. And I think even if they still thinks a few that FE and FO made have turned up. She hasn't.
They have some in their collection, I know.
Wow.
And the one, the only sister of the twins, who was the youngest, Chansonetta, became quite interested in photography, and naturally, since her brothers made dry plates, and she had all the film she needed, and she took quite a few pictures from of the era, and they found a lot of them. They were given a lot of the negatives, and they've had prints made from them, and a lot of them are on display at the museum.
And there's a book about Chansonetta and her photography. She was one of several, of course, famous female photographers of the turn of the century period. And she, all her pictures were black and white because that's all they had in those days, but apparently she was quite good at composition, and then she did recognize that life was changing, and she photographed rural life in Maine as it was right after 1900. And of course, completely changed now. And she also went down in South Carolina, South Carolina mostly. Took a lot of pictures of black people, white people. Some of the whites down there were pretty poor too, and all that, how they lived in those same years. And then she would tint these black and white pictures and make them into sort of like colored slides, and would go around and lecture. And she had one daughter, and she would go with her mother, and together they would lecture. And Chansonetta became quite deaf before she died, so Dorothy, the daughter, I guess had to do more of the speaking then than her mother did.
But it's amazing how many of the negatives have survived. And the ones of the black people in the South are very popular now because of the black movement. There aren't any real good photographs of how they lived back in the turn of the century days, except all of a sudden these have turned up and become very popular. I think they're down in the National Galleries.
Well, as I said, this was just kind of an overview of Stanley Steamers and history, and probably too much of both tonight, and not any technical stuff tonight. So you probably won't have the questions tonight that you will have later when we get into things. But if you have any, I'd certainly be glad to try to answer them. Yes, Gene?
A comment talking about Stanley family. About 100 miles north of here in Chatham, New Jersey, the granddaughter Sarah Stanley resides there.
Right.
John Davis.
Yes, Sarah.
Stanley. He has Stanley in Buffalo.
Right. Yeah, I've known Sarah probably 15 years, and I've known some of her family longer than that. This Ray was her grandfather that I mentioned, died in 1985. And Ray had one son and one daughter, and they don't even speak to each other. And this is one of the peculiarities that happen, I guess, in families, but they didn't get along. Well, the daughter's a real kook. She is. She's not even a fruit cake. But anyway, my brother is a little unusual too, but I would say he's by far the more sensible of the two. And he's an architect in New Mexico, and he's Sarah's father. And Sarah was one of 6. There were 3 girls and 3 boys in that family. So there are quite a few of F.E.'s descendants, but except for Sarah, none of them really live around here. Most of them live in New Mexico. She has a sister, Constance, who lives in Ohio, I believe. And Sarah was a career gal in Minneapolis until she met Don Davidson.
I imagine artist, I guess.
Artist? Maybe.
I assume
She's
because
certainly
I think
artistic.
she did the
Yeah,
banner.
yeah. One of her brothers is either an architect or builder out there, and, but I guess the father would kind of be retired now. He's older than I am. He's Francis E. II. He was born in 1920, so he'll be 80 this year. We should have called on when we were in Santa Fe about a month ago, but we didn't this time.
Didn't the brothers, when they were in the photographic business, invent a machine to put the film, the chemical, on the dry plates and patent it?
Yeah, F.E. really had that developed, perfected, and that was just about the time that F.O. came into business with him, and both names, I think, are on the patent.
And that's really, I think, the reason Eastman wanted to buy the company for that machine and those patents.
Yeah, that was supposed to be the best in the industry, I guess, that method of spreading the emulsion evenly on the plate. My father was a great photographer for a young fellow, and was for most of his life. He wanted to take pictures when he was 12 years old, and his parents told him if he really wanted to do it, he'd have to learn to do it right. And they had a cousin named Horace Dilworth. Is Richard still doing it?
Yeah.
Well, Horace lived, you know where the Phippses lived?
Right.
Richard, Horace and Sarah Dilworth lived there in the big house, and he was a man of all talents. He helped old Colonel Henry DuPont with his dairy herd and perfecting his dairy cattle. He was also in the General Assembly in Dover. He was a surveyor and architect and all kinds of things. Well, Horace Dilworth was quite a photographer, so my grandparents told my father when he was 12, if he wanted to learn to take pictures, he'd have to go over and spend a little time with Horace, and he could show him how to do it right. So my father went over, I guess my grandmother dressed him all up in his best suit and went over to see how Horace Dilworth. So the first thing Horace did was take a picture of my father. So I have that picture of this 12-year-old, with his best suit on. But anyway, I guess he taught him well, because my dad took a lot of pictures. Some are on the walls here, but mostly on Stanley dry plates. We wonder why. I had all these old cameras, and I suppose I should have kept them, but I gave them all to Hagley about 10 years ago. And I thought Hagley wanted that sort of thing, but here within the last couple of years they sold them all. They said it was not appropriate to what they were collecting. This is what happens when you give things to museums. But you can't really fault the museum. I mean, it accepted everything that people wanted to give, and it just couldn't take care of everything. Well, I'm about out of the stories and wind and everything else, but if you'd like to mill around, and we have a few refreshments up in the other building before you go, if you'd like.
Does everyone know the schedule, Tom, of,
Well,
Good.
all of the real new fellas got the schedule. I sent out 12 of them.
okay, good.
Now, those of you who have been coming and who were here at our discussion last week didn't get one. There are a few of them. There were a few of them. I think they're still here at the moment. No, I don't have it. But I think the next, we're going to have work nights every Thursday night, but for the lecture series, and some of them will be combined nights, like tonight some of the fellows are working and some of them who come to the lectures can do that. But the next lecture is 2 weeks from tonight, which is
Burners.
Burners.
That's mine.
That's yours.
That's right.
So I've got to tape that one. Is that
That's
right?
right. I'm going to set it up and actually be on the tape for once.
Wow. The movie star.
Enough with the Facebook.
There's enough room on the video for me.
Well, it's nice for Bill to do it, and Rob Wilhelm's going to do the one on boilers, and Herb Kephardt's going to do the one on engines, and they're all pretty good at what they're going to do, so that's real nice that they're doing that. And I hope it's more interesting and more to the point of what you want to learn than tonight, but they thought we should start with the history again and how this course began, and as I mentioned to you, I'm pleased with the first phase of it, because I have 10 or 12 now who are really accomplished operators, and end of our annual steam car